Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We take from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against. We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our interview with the authors.
We know you want actions, not theories, and it's actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about, helping you to become a wicked company.
Right. So do you prefer crickets, or do you prefer beetles, or do you prefer ladybugs?
I think ladybugs, they're quite cute. I like
Yeah, okay. So they are all the nice kind of insects. They're the nice kind of bugs, as opposed to technology bugs. And you and I, neither one of us like technology bugs.
Yeah, let's hope we're going to have the video on this one, right? So,
yes, we better hope that we're gonna. So I love to be a beta tester. I'm really happy to find new things. But technology is only good when it effing works. But enough about my complaining. Enough about my complaining. Who's on the show?
Yes, so today we have Haydn Shaughnessy in here, who is one of the co-authors with Finn Golding on a new book called Transformation Sprint, which it's close to my heart because it's really focused on transformation project in particular and has some great views on that, and generally sort of a book that we seem to have been missing a little bit.
Well, I like the whole idea of doing sprints and doing a transformation sprint to get ready for transformation and give yourself the chances for really, really good success. And this is really aimed at large enterprises who typically don't do very well at these kinds of things. My big takeaways were, again, break it down into small enough pieces, make it a bite-sized piece. Don't try to eat the whole hog and do 3 different large global transformation projects all at once. And the other one, he says, if you look at an organization, they've been through transformations, intentional or otherwise, like adapting to supply chain challenges coming out of the pandemic or adapting to remote working. And so if you look at how these things have been transformational and how they've been successful, it hasn't been without bumps along the way. And if you can look at how, as a company, as an organization, you not only survived the bumps, but thrived and moved through them, it may give you the confidence for future transformation projects. And I love both of those. What about you?
Yeah, that sounds great. I think that the thing that really stuck out for me is the fact that, and I think that goes a little bit back to potentially pivoting or allowing for pivot. And it's essentially saying, he said in his experience, there's a tendency to, move the initial transformation essentially just into a digital transformation. And it's not just a digital transformation. He, in his own words, he said a business is given a pass at having to transform. So they don't do an initial assessment of actually what's the operational structure even look like, why we're not baselining. And I found this a lot as well, where, the right areas are not included, and the transformation sprint itself is one of the methods, I would say, to be able to do exactly that, And I think, therefore, I find it really as a good takeaway to go, when you start, have a look, business should be involved. It's those things always have the dependencies on that, and there's always value to be created by transforming wider into the organization, essentially. Plus, you're de-risking because you're involving other people, other voices, other views, other requirements, and therefore they should all be part of it. Otherwise, it's too tech-driven, and that sets it often up for failure.
And, I've got a background in tech myself and on the business side, and it's finding that balance between the two that's the real art. But again, enough of our waffling. What should we do, Marcus? We should
Let's go to the interview. Hello, everyone. Today we have Haydn Shaughnessy with us. Hello, Haydn. How are you doing? And thank you for making time for us.
You're very welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. As usual, we start at the top. So tell us a little bit about who you are and why you wrote this book.
Okay, so my background is in technology, not in IT particularly, but in product development, but also in think tanks. So I've done a lot of product development work in my life, but I've also done a lot of thinking about that, a lot of writing about it as well. About 3 years ago, Finn Goulding and I set up a company called the Flow Academy. And Flow Academy is a transformation specialist. So we do a lot of transformation work for organizations in Europe and the United States. And after a period of time, we started to realize a couple of things. One is that most transformations go wrong. That's fairly well evidenced. But also that the transformations most of the transformations that we've been involved in have probably had the same fault lines. They've probably had the same things going wrong. And that's things like they tend to default to an IT transformation, even though they begin as a business transformation. The business tends to be let off the hook to a certain extent. There are a lot of the things like the promise of new ways of doing business isn't followed through on. And things like the IT transformation itself tends to be a bit half-baked, in that they don't deal with some of the critical dysfunctionality that stems from poor legacy management. So you have this thing where you've got this big transformation, it defaults to IT, it lets the business off the hook, but also it tends not to follow through even on the IT transformation. It doesn't do critical change where it's needed in IT. So you can see why things are going wrong. And because these are all so common, we thought actually there's probably a simple method for addressing this. And that's what we baked into the book. So the book is really a 6-step method for rectifying a transformation that's going wrong or designing one before you set out.
So one of the things I want to kind of get really clear right at the beginning is you talk about transformation and you say it winds up kind of defaulting to IT and then the business gets let off the hook. Is it digital transformation? So one of the things I always try to work on when I'm dealing with clients is getting clear on the terminology. So what is the scope of transformation when you say it? Because we can transform all over the place, but when you say transformation, what are you specifically looking at?
Well, I think that you've just put your finger on one of the big problems, that very often these transformations are designed into mega projects or mega programs, and they try to incorporate far too much. So you can be working on a digital transformation, and within that, you've got an agile transformation that somebody is given the task of trying to stand up. And typically, we worked in an insurance company a couple of years ago where exactly that was happening, that you had all this stuff going on, a big program, a big digital transformation, if you like, at the same time, a big legacy rationalization program that wasn't working particularly well, and at the same time, this other thing going on where they put a couple of agile teams together and actually had nothing for them to do. So yes, they were trying to cover every single base, and that is part of the problem.
So when you say that, the other thing I just wanted to get to as well was that. So I've been in a number of those as well, and when I read the book, the whole idea of looking first of all at, are we actually looking at the right problem? Are we involving the right people? Are we transforming the area we should actually be transforming? Often doesn't seem to really be addressed. So I think it's great when you read the books, like that's great when that happens. If I take one step back from that and say, how do we get organizations more to care about that step, to say, hang on a second, let's treat what we're trying to do, at least for a little bit, as an assumption for the 4 weeks of a sprint or something, and say, let's get a bit more evidence there because we might be missing a trick. And a lot of projects are missing a trick. So how do we get organizations more to care and value that time of the program?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a little story I read recently about heart attack victims. Apparently, anybody who has a heart attack is told to, when they've recovered, go away and exercise more and eat the right things. A study on that particular population found that only between 3 and 5% of people followed that advice. So here you have a problem where most people are risking their lives by not eating better and not exercising properly, even though they've already had the near miss. So this problem of people doing things that they shouldn't do, not following advice, and taking things on that are perhaps beyond them, is very, very common across human nature, society, or whatever you want to describe that as. It's very, very common. And trying to find the catalyst or the switch that says you really don't need to do it this way, I think is very difficult. And our experience would be that you will only really get the chance to do these things if they are small and seen as less important. So I think it would be rare to see organizations say, you know what, we'll abandon that big transformation program that's costing us tens of millions, is going completely wrong, and we'll do something else. We'll do a transformation sprint instead. They won't do that. What they might do is do a transformation sprint as well. So at least with a transformation sprint, you've got a low-cost way of saying, we can now learn something. We can get into an environment where it's predicated on becoming a learning organization. One of the big problems with these transformations is that they do not teach people very much at all. They're not learning environments. And you see that in the way they're set up. They're set up through these long consultation exercises, usually using consultants who are using a model from somewhere else or from their last assignment. You then go through that planning process, as I said earlier. You tend to get very intricate dependencies entwined in those transformations because people have had 12 to 18 months to plan them out, and every time you look at them, you think, well, I could do a bit more there, or I could add this in, or I could add that in, typical of the old requirements documents. So you have this problem that they're intricately planned. The bigger problem comes when you start to design the governance and management of them, because you use very traditional techniques for that. And I think this is one of the great hopes, is that you can say, look, it makes no sense whatsoever to use traditional planning and management and governance techniques to get to somewhere completely new, which is going to be agile, fast-moving, and small. If you can win that argument, fantastic. But even if you can't win the argument, we need to start pushing this observation that the way in which transformations are set up is intricate beyond human ability to deliver against. There's far too many dependencies in there, and that's why they go wrong. Far better that you go back to what we're talking about, which is the kernel of a learning organization, and grow your learning and capability.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what you just described. I've seen in a lot of projects, and I think when it's done right, things like governance were actually included in we need to find a new way of that too.
Yeah.
And I just had a recent experience with a project where the first thing they did was structure everything via governance, and then trying to seemingly figure out what to do, which is totally backwards.
Yeah.
And as you said, also including these classic governance models that are just still ending up with way too many sign-offs. The way managers haven't even shifted their roles yet, but you want to introduce an agile process, which might still in the end just be a garbage in, garbage out system because it doesn't ask the why. But
right.
When I look at that, and you're talking about lots of requirements and lots of things to address, prioritization is always something that comes up, which also often then needs to be rejuvenated or adjusted often because you might be measuring new things. So what's your view then on prioritizing once you start mapping out new things?
Well, I think that just to conclude some thinking on those big programs and the management and governance, the problem with that is what tends to then happen is you also have a conventional set of KPIs, and you also focus on execution. And that's another big problem. You've got all the management and governance in place. It's only about execution now. And that's what we found goes wrong, because people can't execute against these plans. In terms of how you prioritize, I think what companies often fail to do because they don't have the capability to do it, and consultancies don't have the capability, is to understand what the current operating model is. So if you look inside a lot of organizations, you see quite disjointed and incoherent operating models, and that's nobody's fault. So it's not somebody sitting there thinking, I know how to design the way we should get things done, and I'll do it badly. It's more that over time, what's happened is that things have been added into the mix. So you've had, say, in the 1990s, went to global supply chain models, only to be hit by the World Wide Web in 1995 to 2005, and have to adapt to selling online or dealing with their procurement channels online. only to be hit by global mobile in 2007, 2008, and having to deal with that. And then coming across things like, I'm just distracted by the light there, and then coming across things like AI, machine learning, and platforms and business ecosystems. All these things are kind of on a continuous roll over the last 25 years. And it really means that companies have been tasked with doing 2 or 3 simultaneous transformations all the time. I think we need to acknowledge that. If we can back out of the big transformation plan and say, actually, we adapted to global supply chains, the World Wide Web, global mobile. We're now adapting to AI. We're adapting to remote work. And look at it as a continuous process and say, okay, where does that leave our operating model? If we were to describe how we actually function as an organization, what does it look like? And in Transformation Sprint, that's one of the things we recommend, that there's a real focus on what is the existing operating model of the firm. Starting to teach executives what operating models are, because they're not organizational models, they're not org charts, and they're not to do with the IT infrastructure or architecture, they're the business architecture. It's how things get done. And those things, those models operating models, they're changing all the time. We need to stop and think how we develop skills in developing those. And I think when you start to look at an operating model in flight, you start to see what needs to be fixed first. And that's one of the things that we're trying to point out in the book, that actually by defining or describing the operating model as it is, you can see the critical failure points or the critical crisis or risk points and address those, but only address one of them.
So I like what you said when you said kind of look at what we've actually achieved. We've done global supply chain adapting. We've done remote working adapting. And I would hazard a guess that none of them were smooth processes. I would hazard a guess that actually there were a number of kind of faults and failures and problems along the way. And the reason I'm saying this is I think a lot of people look at transformation and innovation in general as being very risky, and they're afraid to try things. So I think if we can look back and say, yeah, well, we tried a whole bunch of different stuff. Some of it worked, some of it didn't, but we survived and became a stronger organization for it. That's really important. How in a transformation sprint do you help organizations get ready for things not working and dare I say the F word for failure?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the points we try to make is exactly that. How do you deal with failure if you're not a learning organization? Very often, companies don't learn from those failures because that's the moment when you start firing people, or it's the moment when the transformation director looks for another job, or she's probably already been looking for one for 3 months. So a lot of the things that happen in this failure environment are what generally happens when it starts to hit the fan. So what you need to do is to again peel all that back and just say, okay, we can start with one project. We can look at our as-is condition, our as-is operating model, and we can identify really critical points of dysfunctionality. What's causing these dysfunctions? What's the underlying cause of the dysfunctionality that we're suffering from? And let's address that. But let's address it in one project. And we call those projects lighthouse projects. And what we mean by the lighthouse project is that it's not just another program. It's not just another innovation. It's not a project like an MVP or a pilot or a proof of concept. It's a way of saying we're going to make one critical structural change. We're going to fix one structural problem and one only. We're going to do it through new ways to work, and we're going to do it really quickly. We're going to deliver value very quickly. So we're going to be delivering value within a month of starting. So if you start to take that approach, you can start to test what it means to be a learning organization. Because the first thing that you find when you start to do these lighthouse projects is it starts to dawn on people that they don't actually have the skills to execute them. And that's another big problem, that very often the transformation programs rely on who's there. They do rely on contractors who are not necessarily any more skilled than people in the organization. They rely more on consultants who are not doing anything for your context. They're really working out their business model, and they rely on vendors. But they very, very rarely rely on the skill, ingenuity, commitment, and engagement of the people working in the firm. And it shows when you start to do the Lighthouse project, it really shows, because what it means is very often looking around and saying, well, the way this is going to go, if we're going to, say, rationalize some element of the IT estate, we actually don't have the skills around to execute on the next new normal. So getting these experiences, having the opportunity to get these experiences, say one of the Lighthouse projects we tend to favour is one where you do a lot of value discovery. So you go and segment your market differently, and you look within those segments at new things that you could be offering to the market, and you start to revise or refresh your innovation capability, your innovation model, if you like, or innovation processes. So when you do that, again, it tends to be the case that most organizations have jettisoned the critical insight capability that they once had, just like they've jettisoned a lot of their R&D capability, because now we rely on lean startup and fail fast, fail cheap, those types of scattergun approaches. There was a study recently, it was published recently anyway, that actually looked at the massive innovation deficit and traced it back to the way companies have been closing down their R&D departments. But you have to remember, a lot of those R&D departments would have had in them philosophers, mathematicians who were not doing anything related to AI. They were just thinking. There would be, I remember IBM used to hire loads of people like that just for having the brain power around. There would be anthropologists, there'd be sociologists. All these people were gathering insight continuously about how markets were changing. Most companies don't have that because they think that big data is going to solve that problem. So you start to wrestle with this Lighthouse project. We're going to refresh the innovation process. Then you get into it and you see, actually, we don't have the insight capability to do that. And therefore, look at the learning. Within weeks, you've learned we need to start refreshing this area of our business. We need to start rehiring or accessing people who have genuine insight around customer segments. Now I've lost track of the question, but my answer is to whatever the question was. Lighthouse projects get you back to these critical learning opportunities, and that's what companies need more than anything else.
Yeah, and I think there's about probably at least 3 things in there exactly the way you answered, and they're all great points. So I would like to follow on the one where we say, again, I'm drawing some experience in here where we had projects, for example, when we started with 3 teams, and 2 of them ended up actually pivoting because they found something, right? And my background is design thinking, service design, which is a lot about investigating the problem. Is it really a problem? Checking if the assumptions hold up. So we ended up being able, as a luxury, I guess, to pivot quite a few teams and projects. However, the way you just described it sounds like there might be a main purpose of the transformation sprint that's not just to plan and risk assess and get a few things straight and discover a few things, but actually to mainly discover if you can actually do it or not. And when you're saying learning needs to happen, it's like, oh, we forgot the whole learning thing. I was like, yeah, it's a maturity check on a bit of a checklist of things. For that, would you say that's more correct? And therefore, it should be used for that more often without the anticipation, even a transformation to kick off.
Well, I think that's a critical point. And Finn, my partner and co-author, introduced me to a phrase that I love using as if it's mine, actually. Being there is not a qualification. And very often that's what you get with transformations. You've got a transformation director who just happens to be there in another role and they get appointed. You get various people in that mix as well who just happen to be there and they get appointed. So you're already starting off without enough awareness or appreciation of the skills it takes even to design a transformation, let alone manage it when it's in flight. So what can you say about that? That we can use constructively. How hard is it for an organization to acknowledge that it doesn't have the skills that will equip it for the future? I don't think that should be a difficult thing to do, but what makes it difficult is often that HR is concerned with something else. So HR might be concerned with, it might be the communications in the transformation, or it might be that they are wrapped up with problems around hiring into parts of the organization where there's a large amount of staff churn. They're not necessarily focused on, or nor do they understand, and nor does anybody necessarily understand, what skills do we need when this transformation becomes real? When we've got to the outcome stage, what skills does it take to manage this business going forward? And I think that's a really big deficit in transformations, like the inquiry and the continuous investigation of what skills are we going to need, let alone what skills do we need right now.
And even then further, as maybe nearly an obvious step, I'd like to have your view on that, because we literally on Monday we recorded an episode with Jeff Schwartz from Deloitte, who's working in human capital. So we talked about, they had done some research with CEOs or leadership who weren't even aware to the amount of their existing employees and how much they actually want to learn new things and are happy to do so. Their perception was like, no, we have to way bigger amount, have to let go and then hire new talent. So that goes to that kind of hiring and firing whenever transformation happens, and most companies anticipating it will be a fair amount and we want to minimize that cost, how we do that. Whereas research shows if you probably do learning better, you're actually going to end up with being able to upskill people. But what's your view on that in order to, how can you bring that in? Do you need to bring that in during the transformation sprint, or can you learn that on the go while you're phasing in or sort of raising those capabilities on new ways of working? What's your experience there?
I think with transformation sprints, what you're primarily trying to do, what you're trying to do with transformation sprint is design the lighthouse project. And that lighthouse project is your opportunity to learn and your opportunity to embed learning as a critical mechanism in change. So you have to appreciate that limitation, I think. Once you start to do that, once you start to think about this one critical project that's addressing one structural element, you can start to expand that outwards, and you can start to use the people in the initial team to seed human capital development, if you like to use that term, in other teams. So you can grow outwards, you can cell divide and amoeba-like grow your transformation that way. There's a tendency amongst large organizations and people higher in the echelon not to particularly like small projects. Big projects are what really matter. The problem with the big project, again, it's another problem. We don't want to talk about problems all the time, but you pointed it out. A lot of the people in that program know they're for the sack. You know, they remember when Lean first came in, and Lean at the moment is getting a pass from its quite tawdry past in some respects. If you went into organizations 10 years ago and mentioned the word Lean, people would run for cover because they knew that it was their job at stake. And they'd seen a lot of their colleagues being unceremoniously dumped. And that's the case with transformations. You know, it's unfortunate, but the way they're set up, the fact that they are planned and run by consultants, that they immediately bring in loads of contractors, that they don't trust the people in the organization to plan, design, or execute on the transformation, all those are red flags, and they are all going to cause you problems because you will immediately create the levels of passive aggression, sometimes outright aggression, that absolutely derail what you're trying to do.
All right. So we know how to crash and burn. We know we've got a great book that we can refer to, great customers and colleagues on how to do a transformation sprint and how to do a lighthouse project. Can you tell us a story of one great success and why it was such a success?
I think that question would be better put to an existing traditional transformation project because they are great big programs. What you really need to look for are small successes. Yeah, okay. So one of the examples we give in the book is at Paddy Power, where they had managed, like a lot of companies do, to generate something like 7 core platforms, all more or less replicating what the first of those platforms did. So rather than ever rationalizing platform 1, they grew another platform and another and another and another. The way in which that would ordinarily be involved would be very disruptive to the organization. But what Paddy Power did in that particular case was say, okay, we are not going to do that big transformation program. we'll take one part of our core platform and we'll experiment with how to make that work more effectively with one product line. And that particular product line for a company that works across all gambling and gaming products, was just one in dog racing. And they used that as a way to learn what it meant to do the transformation, what changes were necessary, what new skills were necessary, what the timescale would look like, what resources looked like, what the learning ramp looked like, and used all that then to move on to the next product and then the next product, doing that cell division, as I mentioned earlier, along the way.
Yeah, and I think one aspect that brings me back a little bit back to people again. So the other thing, and again, I'm speaking a little bit there from a design thinking, service design, which is a newish kind of practice in that space. But you got business analysts, you got enterprise architects. If we talk about practices, and especially going back to nearly the first question around, well, in that sprint or when you're prepping for a transformation, you should actually go and start talking to multiple stakeholders, a lot of different backgrounds, so you get a more holistic view on things and might more quickly get an idea about if you're on the right track or not and what matters really. How do you think about bringing these different practices together in terms of often, the language they use and so on? And do you think it's sort of an outdated model where you say, stop those silos, stop that? The practices don't work anymore because there's too many overlapping ones who are all trying to do the same thing with slightly different tools?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting point, isn't it? Because you've now got CX design, UX design, design thinking, design sprints, product design, product discovery. So there are a lot of methods out there. I think that the critical missing factor, if you like, is what happens when companies change in an unconscious way or when they change in ad hoc ways. So let's explore that problem or that situation and see what skills apply. I'll give you an example. It could be one of many. I'll just focus on one. It's an organization that was going to do a digital transformation. It did a digital transformation of sorts, not a very complete one, but it went from being a bricks and mortar B2B business, so it never owned the shops, but it supplied into them, to creating a global mobile capability. So now it can sell via mobile operators or principally mobile operators. Now, its next move was to say, we can be a platform and ecosystem business because we don't just want to rely on retail or the mobile operator to do end delivery to customers. If we can create an ecosystem of independent vendors or independent retailers, we can balance our overall portfolio so we're not dependent on the large retail community. Now, that is all very, very sensible strategy. I don't think anybody would question that in moving that way, you also give yourself the opportunity to disintermediate the retailer, which disintermediation is a bit bloody, but it has to happen. So what that means in terms of how the organization functions, it means that the company has three operating models. It has its retail operating model, where all of its reflexes are designed around getting product into retail stores. All its sales processes and its accounting systems are predicated on that as well. Now you've got this other operating model where it's all digital. You're pushing product in a digital channel through mobile operators. And here you're trying to develop a third one, which is to do with independent vendors, but only in the sense that you're not pushing product to them, you're allowing them to use their facilities, and you are bringing customers to them. So you're trying to develop a quite different relationship there. That's manageable if you're conscious of it. If you have a chart which says our current operating model is made up of these three major components, each of those major components has different technological platforms associated with it, and therefore has different software development requirements around it. What happens in these kind of situations, and this is not uncommon, it's a really, really common problem. What happens in situations like that is the software team here will be saying, we're developing for our core retail B2B business. And then VP will come along and say, no, I need you to prioritize the mobile channel. So they start prioritizing the mobile channel. And then it's annual sales day. And the CEO says, why haven't all these things been prepared, ready for annual sales day? And all those people will be dragged off that mobile channel onto that channel. Meanwhile, there'll be the guy running the platform and ecosystem operating side of it, who'll be saying, I need those people as well. So he takes people from the mobile channel. So you get people dragged between these different operating models the whole time. The problem with that is you might be really, really well resourced. You might be adequately resourced to service all three elements. But when you start dragging people back and forth, they start to context switch, their efficiency drops off a cliff, and you end up with a lot of people not doing very much well. So you can sort of shoot yourself in the foot by not having operating model awareness and not designing around it, making sure that you service those operating models properly, not just on the software development side, because on the business side as well. Your business people need to know. And we've seen situations where sales and marketing are saying to themselves, our main goals are to sell more stuff to those retailers. And the CEO is saying, no, your main goal is to stop shopping cart dropout. And they're saying, but why didn't you tell us? And they're saying, we thought we had. But it's like, mixed priorities, mixed goals, mixed messages, people not really knowing what they're doing, but nobody knowing that they don't have the right instructions. That is really, really common. Now, how does design thinking deal with that? Or design thinking?
Well, that's a really good question back there, and I think it's one of the things I came across tons of times. So in my case, I ended up talking to the different practices and say, why don't we align those things, that we actually have the same names, the same target descriptions, inclusive enough so that people get a more fleshed out picture of what do we actually want, and tie those things together. I wouldn't say necessarily that I've been ever in a project long enough for those to really work vertically, on different managerial levels well enough. But some ambitions I've seen, and I think we got to a couple of good places there. I think it's probably that, which, and I totally agree. I'm not married to service design and design thinking because I work too much with other people to be happy to, work with what works. But it's really interesting, that language issue, because it goes all the way up to business. And then, how do you how you enable something that can communicate in between all these things,
Well,
go ahead.
I think there's a good case for saying that there have to be an inclusive design capability that includes the architecture of how things get done, as well as the architecture of as well as the inspiration or design of the product or the brand or those things. If you look at what's happening right now, we've got even more diversity and proliferation on the way, because over the past 2 years, you've got a lot of product design that is not actually product design. It's feature design or it's feature management. So you go onto any product design website at the moment, what you're really looking at is a little bit of software to tweak a feature. And it comes under the rubric of product design. And it's all part of this big project to product transition. So now we've got, on top of design thinking, service design, and design sprints, UX design, CX design, product design. And they're all in their own way being trivialized by the extent of that diversity. And I do think it would be better to bring them together under something which said, actually what we're about is designing the future. So, we are the future of business department, and our job is to design sustainable futures for the organization.
Absolutely.
And
Because otherwise,
as much as we'd love to keep talking to you, I'm afraid we're running out of time, because we could sit here and talk to you for the rest of the evening, I'm afraid. But Marcus, why don't you wrap us up?
Yeah, so just then maybe please a comment on the very last question. A little bit following up from exactly that, I think it's one of my questions I always like to squeeze in somehow, which is the idea between, specialists and polymath or jack of all trades. If we're giving that and we're saying, there are all these different things out there and we want to create less silos, which specialists tend to be very comfortable in at times. What's your view on, are we living a bit more in a time where the jack of all trades or the systemic thinkers are should be running things more, or can contribute more than previously specialists, maybe?
I do think that this is an active process, that we've gone more and more towards specialization. That's not really specialization, it's just limitation. So a lot of those things we just described, like product design, is a limitation on people's ability to act and think. And a wider design brief is much more appropriate. So I think that we need to recognize the fact that this is not specialization, it's limitation. At the same time, looking at the other end of the problem, I do think that in the age of Google, the generalist is a multi-specialist. We don't need to have there are areas like data science where you can say, look, if you've not done the right maths, you're never going to get this. But outside of those very specialized areas, I think that most generalists can be a specialist, like lawyers can be a specialist in. Each case is different, and each case they relearn from scratch. So we can all do that these days.
Lovely. Great words to wrap this up with. Haydn, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. Thank you for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
You've been listening to The Wicked Podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.